Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a huge paradox. You've got India and China, two major geopolitical rivals, but their economic relationship, well, it's telling a totally different and, honestly, a pretty surprising story. I mean, you would think that with all the political friction, especially since that big flare-up in the Galwan Valley back in 2020, their economic ties would have taken a nosedive, right? But nope, the exact opposite has happened. In fact, their trade has blown past every single record. In 2025, that trade number rocketed to an all-time high of $155 billion. And get this, that's a 12% jump in just 1 year. It's a staggering figure.
But is this really a win-win situation? That huge number sounds great on the surface, but once you start to peel back the layers, you find a much more complicated and, frankly, a very lopsided picture.
So let's get into it. Let's break that record number down and see what's really going on here.
So that $155 billion is the total, right? It's made up of two pieces, what India sells to China and what it buys from them. And this is where the story takes a really sharp turn.
And the difference is just wow. India's exports to China were just under $20 billion, but its imports from China, a colossal $136 billion. It's not even close. So what does that leave us with? It leaves India with its biggest trade deficit ever with any country, a massive $116 billion in the red.
Here's maybe a simpler way to think about it, and this really captures the sheer scale of the imbalance. For every $1 worth of stuff India sells to China, $7 worth of Chinese goods comes flooding right back in.
And you know, this isn't some new one-off problem. This gap has been widening like crazy, jumping from nearly $100 billion in 2024 to today's record high. It's a trend, and it's accelerating. So, you have to ask, why? Why is this happening? How did this massive imbalance even start? And more importantly, why does it just keep getting bigger?
A huge piece of the puzzle comes down to what is actually being traded. For the most part, India is sending over lower-value raw materials, things like iron ore, cotton. But what's coming back? It's all the high-value, high-tech manufactured stuff, electronics, heavy machinery, and even things like solar panels.
So you can really boil it down to three key drivers. First, just sheer economic necessity. Second, the hard realities of today's global supply chains. And third, China's own strategic economic moves.
Despite all the tough talk from politicians, the simple truth is that India's manufacturing industry depends on Chinese parts and machinery. It just does. And at the same time, China really needs India's enormous consumer market, especially now that its relationships with Western countries are getting pretty rocky. So at the end of the day, economic needs are just steamrolling right over political friction.
And this really gets to the heart of the supply chain reality. Even when the Indian government tries to find other partners, the laws of the market just keep pulling businesses back to China. And why is that? It's because right now, they are simply the cheapest, the fastest, and the biggest supplier on the planet. Period.
So this deep but very lopsided relationship creates a really tricky dilemma for India. It comes with some pretty big short-term benefits, but also some even bigger long-term risks. On one hand, you've got the benefits. All those cheap imports from China are great for keeping inflation down, and they provide the essential parts that keep Indian factories running. But on the other hand, this creates a huge dependency. And that's a serious strategic vulnerability.
And this dependency gets especially risky when you look at absolutely critical sectors like telecom, electronics, and even power. I mean, being so reliant on a geopolitical rival for these basic building blocks could seriously limit India's options and its bargaining power, especially if a crisis ever hits.
So what's the plan? What's the path forward? What is India actually doing to try and tackle this pretty massive long-term challenge?
Well, the government's response isn't some single magic bullet solution. It's a multi-part, long-term strategy. The whole focus is on building up its own domestic strength and resilience to slowly but surely chip away at this dependency.
And this includes big pushes like the Make in India campaign to boost local production, actively trying to diversify supply chains to new partners like the US and Australia, and also using tariffs to protect and grow its own homegrown industries. The ultimate goal here is to make Made in India a truly competitive choice on the world stage.
But here's the catch. Even with all of these major efforts, imports from China just keep on growing. And this leaves us with the central, maybe billion-dollar question for this incredibly critical and complicated relationship. Can a long-term national strategy ever really win against the powerful day-to-day realities of the global market? That's the question that remains to be answered.